What comes to mind when I say news? Do you think of a video on your phone or a blaring breaking news headline popping up on your television screen? Maybe you imagine a row of newspapers, bold black letters printed carefully on crisp white paper. Does your image of news get a face? Perhaps a figure poised over a notebook with pen in hand, or maybe even at a typewriter or computer, working late into the night? Our understanding of news and journalism is one that generates many different images. Such a perception is the result of a deep-set tension between journalists and outside factors, such as profit and maintaining public prestige, that keep journalists from their ultimate goal: spreading truth. Such a tension was present even in the 1700s, as newspapers and their platform as a free institution were challenged and heavily censored by governments. In 1733, the New York Weekly Journal was created by American James Alexander, the Attorney General for New York and New Jersey, as a political forum for colonists who opposed the royal governor of New York. When the governor decided to punish the journal for its offensive articles, he attacked the journal's publisher, a man named Zenger, as the one responsible for the publication, even though it was Alexander who wrote most of the articles. Zenger's trial was one of heated discourse and debate. In one moment, Zenger's attorney argued to the court that this case had significant implications, as the verdict would lay, quote, "a noble foundation for securing to ourselves, our posterity, and our neighbors that to which nature and the laws governing this country have given us a right, the liberty, both of opposing and exposing arbitrary power, in these parts of the world at least, by speaking and writing truth." Such powerful words and the court's final ruling in favor of Zenger established truth as a defense against the charges of spreading information, which marked the advent of journalism in a free press culture. The trial also made an important distinction between the publisher and the journalist, as Zenger, the publisher, was the one put on trial, even though it was Alexander, the journalist, who wrote most of the articles. It was the publisher who was accountable for spreading truth, even though he played only a minor role in its discovery. The inceptive years of journalism were further defined by the American Revolution, which continued to prove the importance of newspapers in society. American newspapers played a key role in encouraging patriot activity, building public morale, and reporting on events throughout the colonies, even though disseminating newspapers was still a slow process. Newspapers were instrumental in convincing Americans that they had a united goal that required united action, even publishing criticisms of British tactics and making victory seem closer than it may have actually been. When the American colonists were finally able to achieve their victory and independence, they realized that the need for free speech and the importance of newspapers in having the power to spread truth was one that had to be incorporated into their nation's foundation. The Bill of Rights, added to the United States Constitution in 1789, protected the freedom of both speech and press. It upheld the conclusions made from both the Zenger case and the war, and framed American journalism for years of growth and influence. Fast forward to the 20th century, and such a development needs no introduction. Journalism in the 1900s began to take many forms and explore new mediums, complicating the image journalism had presented in years past. A distinctive feature of 20th century journalism was highlighted by a competition between two publications, Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. Each man wanted to increase the circulation of his newspaper. To do so, both publications began including more sensational, eye-catching news with bold headlines and illustrations, even if the news wasn't necessarily accurate. An important distinction in this competition as well is that both Hearst and Pulitzer were their newspapers' publishers. So again, it was the publisher who was the one accountable for spreading the information, even though in this case, unlike the Zenger case, the publishers were also the ones dictating the type of news being shared. Such news, later called yellow journalism, proved a successful avenue to hook readers, yet it failed to maintain truth as the standard for providing information, choosing profit as the more important goal. Yellow journalism marked a specific turning point as it sparked the creation of a new feature of the journalistic image. Even though publications during the American Revolution intended to stir up sentiment in their audiences, they were more intended to boost morale than to use aggressive tactics to make their publications more popular and profitable. In 1919, the New York Illustrated Daily News, one of the first American tabloids, capitalized on this concept of shocking news. Its founder, Joseph Patterson, learned of Britain's success with tabloids as a type of publication that appealed to the semi-literate population by producing information that deviated from the typical serious articles. Patterson's publication focused on sports, crime, and scandals. Such news became a public obsession, and yet another aspect of our current image of journalism, the writing of the human experience, flourished. This aspect yet again overshadowed the importance of spreading truth, as another publisher, seeking profit from a wider reading audience, encouraged his journalists to write more about striking aspects of the human experience. This burst of novelty was matched by the invention and increasing popularity of the radio, which radically changed the way people received news and entertainment. At this point, even with all the personas publications were trying to create, journalism began to slip. The popularity of the radio, closely followed by the invention of television, set new standards for transmitting information. During World War II, the government actively monitored media, and journalists often participated in propaganda to sustain themselves. Publications focused more on profit by uniting the nation through the war cause than by reaching beyond enforced boundaries to produce truthful information that may have caused the nation to divide. By making this sacrifice, the press was wrought with widespread scrutiny during the 1950s and 60s. Newspapers found themselves forced to explain the necessity for their place in society among government scrutiny and the appeal of television, as it could consistently produce visual and audible media with no mistakes at rapid speed. It would take decades before journalism found its way back into society through the pathway that it had entered: spreading truth. In the 1970s, breaking stories on the Watergate scandal and Pentagon Papers enhanced journalists' role in society as the voice of the people and harkened back to the First Amendment in its right to publish true news without censorship. This step also identified journalists and not their publishers as the face behind the news, as it was individual journalists who were investigating and sharing these stories. To reinforce their promise of trust to the people, journalists also established codes of ethics and standards to prevent their involvement in activities that would hurt their reputation. They wanted to reinforce that their relationship with the people was one based on trust, that would not be broken by desires for profit and work separately from the federal government. In addition, young publishers began to take over prominent newspapers with the intent to challenge authority. The search for truth was once again at the forefront. This new strength in codes and leadership propelled journalism forward into a foreboding era. In the end of the 20th century, news was forced to compete with new technologies that rapidly changed readers' expectations. Publications once again pressed profit over product journalism to keep up with the quick pace of television news and the internet, which, with the help of the laptop, became a large part of homes and businesses. This time, truth was challenged by the need to be popular, profitable, and fast. The ability to have constant access to up-to-date news, entertainment, and information was a complete shift in society's understanding of space and time. For traditional journalists, it meant that people no longer looked to them for this up-to-date news because it was all within the reader's control and on their schedule. For the first time, newspapers were forced to run somebody else's race and churn out information at a speed dictated by the audience, not the other way around. They moved quickly to accommodate these changes and keep with the times, and suddenly, they found themselves in the 21st century, a fast-paced, high-tech era. Not only did they carry baggage from the past, including centuries of distrust, uncertainty, and fluctuation, but the rise of social media and hyperconnectivity brought a slew of challenges. Now, information can come from many different sources. The algorithms and programs on social media are not journalists bound to codes of ethics. They promote articles, videos, and posts that spark controversy or engage a reader based on what that reader has searched for before, because fear, anger, and a desire to believe one's own ideas are more interesting and thus more profitable, even if they aren't true. An engrossing article that is not true causes distrust among readers. A 2018 survey done by Gallup and the Knight Foundation found that Americans recognize 65% of information on social media as misinformation. But people continue to use social media for news. In fact, 2/3 of adults say that they get their news from these platforms. Why? Because it's fast, efficient, and easily catches their attention. It's yellow journalism times 10. So when those same Americans say they distrust such information, the burden to uphold truth doesn't fall on social media, the publishers, it falls on the journalists. No longer like the Zenger case, journalists have individualized themselves as the face behind the news. But while at times such recognition leads to praise, more often in today's society, it leads to a heightened distrust. For some reason, people seem to categorize the information that pops up on their screens as genuine factual news, but that is simply not the case. On November 27th, 2 of the 5 stories on YouTube's World News homepage were from a Kremlin-backed news source called Russia Today, which is known for its misinformation. But while YouTube continues to thrive as a platform, since 2004, the US has lost nearly 2,000 newspapers, according to the UNC Center for Innovation and Sustainability in Local Media. The myriad of identities journalism has acquired over just the last few centuries has augmented its image in modern society to the point where it is unrecognizable from other sources of information. While it is impossible to stop the rapid development of new technologies, it is possible to take a step back and remember how this honorable trade is essential to democracy and why the founders of this nation believed it was so important that it had to be incorporated into the country's foundation. For the past 2 summers, I have participated in 2 journalism programs. one in Oxford, England, and the other in New York City. Each opened my eyes to the work of this profession. I was able to spend time with editors and freelance journalists who constantly encouraged the students in the program to be curious, observant, and perceptive. At Oxford, one of my first lessons was learning about the difference between a tourist and a traveler. Tourists make it obvious that they are outsiders, while travelers observe their surroundings and adapt to the culture. Such a metaphor can easily be applied to journalism. I remember on our day trip to London, we wanted to visit the Grenfell apartment tower, as it had tragically burned down that summer. By the time we were ready to go, it was already late, as we had spent the day visiting museums and other sites. While we all wanted to go, my instructor, a photojournalist, pointed out that if we wanted to go to say that we had been there, we were simply acting like tourists and would have shown no respect to those who were mourning. If we wanted to go to be journalists, we should have gone earlier in the day and spent hours there respectfully observing the scene and taking in the emotions to truly understand what had happened. It was a realization I'll never forget. Looking at the history of journalism, we see that the same idea of a tourist versus a traveler can also be applied to the many tensions journalists face throughout their development. Challenges such as publishers seeking profit with sensational fast news are just like tourists out in public with their conspicuous way of sharing information. While journalists, however, stayed in the shadows, observing the world around them through a more truthful internal lens. Through years of war, public distrust, and confusion, journalists were seeking to depict the world as it truly was, to allow their readers the power to come to their own conclusions, not pump out information for profit like publishers, or force ideas into the readers' heads like a social media site. However, it is also true that such forces are beneficial to the development of journalism, especially as business interests and the need for profit have caused journalists to change their approach to the type of news they share and the medium through which it is disseminated. So, in actuality, we see that these two seemingly antagonistic forces, the need to be successful in mainstream culture and the need to disseminate truth, are catalyzing each other's prominence in modern news culture. While it may seem as though many new factors are trying to erase the trustworthiness of news, today is also the time when a new generation of journalists are emerging. Just like the journalists and publishers of the 1970s, young minds are not only challenging what's presented to them as news, but they have a burning desire to hold people accountable. Having grown up with social media, the internet, and new technologies that are developing constantly, they are equipped to ubiquitously share stories. They are not advocating for the abandonment of social media, but are working alongside its development to communicate on their audience's level. Thus, the tensions are again at work, and the overwhelming presence of social media and technology's continual development are not one that can be stopped. Rather, we must understand that such advancements are only accessories decorating the image of journalism. If you strip all those aspects away, you realize that it is not sensationalism and journalism, propaganda and journalism, or even Twitter and journalism. The key is truth and journalism. Thank you very much.